So I firmly believe that Trump has heavily participated in Epstein activities and blown Bubba. And I believe that JD Vance has basically had a gay makeover sponsored by Peter Thiel. And Ro Khanna, a congressman from California, put this perfectly, that there are these people that are part of the Epstein class. Basically, this class in society who feels like they are above the normal rules that would apply to the rest of us, that they feel like they are basically unaccountable for their actions. Not that I believe that Trump giving Bill Clinton a humdinger is such a big deal. In a lot of ways, that's the least harmful of what's being alleged here. But to me, it's a total hypocrisy of someone advocating for one thing in public, like release of the files or draining the swamp, and then doing something entirely different behind closed doors, like an ongoing cover-up of the files, or the only thing that Trump has drained is a guy named Bubba. So, welcome to Left and Loose. I'm your host, Rich Kim. This is the mostly weekly show where I pour a big glass, sometimes sporting an Asian glow, and call out Republican bullshit. And in this week, we're going to cover this very insane Epstein saga. But before we do so, just two things. First, clearly this is a developing story. I'm recording this sometime after the House and Senate have passed and Trump has signed into law this bill requiring release of the Epstein files from the Department of Justice, even though Trump could do that himself this whole time. And there will be, after this episode, further information that comes out from that release. But I can guarantee you that this episode will help you to understand what ultimately does get released one way or the other. As part of this is my description of why that's likely to be a cover-up. And second, and this is just a logistical point, would really appreciate if folks listening to this episode could give me a rating, whether that's on YouTube with a like and follow, of course, or whether that's with on podcasts, like for example, on the Apple Podcast app, you can click go to show and then go down to the bottom, and it's very easy to then give a rating and give a review. So that's appreciated to help spread the word about this show. And just as I guess as a last point, actually, when there is further information released here, I also have this social media channel where I walk and rant about the daily news cycle, and I post there about 4 to 5 times a week. So for further updates, you can also check out my channels on Instagram and TikTok. So now getting on to the show. This Epstein saga has drawn a lot of theories and a lot of public attention, and rightly so, given how horrible and mysterious a lot of this is. But already what the MAGA base is currently doing is to try to say, oh, this is a Democratic hoax, or nobody's even interested in this, because they're already trying to cover for Trump, who, based on what we know, seems to be implicated in these files. And just to address that briefly, this whole point of like, oh, we should just move on. This was an international trafficking ring of young girls, 2 pedophiles that involved some of the most prominent business and political elites in our country, including what seems to be the President of the United States, and led by a ringleader who ultimately died under mysterious circumstances during that president's first term. And furthermore, this is a case where the elites who participate in this have not been held meaningfully accountable, unless somebody wants to play the world's smallest violin for Prince Andrew losing his titles, or Larry Summers losing some positions on some corporate or university boards. Plus, based on everything we seem to know, there seems to be an ongoing cover-up of what's happening in these files. So that's all to say that this case is still an important one with a lot of loose ends that is worth meaningfully digging into in order to actually hold people accountable here. Okay, so given that this was a complicated and horrible saga, I'm going to break down this episode into three portions. First, there's what we know about the Epstein case itself. Second is how the right then used this as a political tool and folded when they realized that Trump was implicated in this. And third is what we're likely to see with the Epstein files release and how this is all part of this idea of the Epstein class. And as a spoiler alert, as mentioned, my feelings about this release is that there will in fact be a cover-up. So first, what we know about the Epstein case. First, it's really unclear how Epstein became fabulously wealthy as he was. On paper, the story was that this guy was a tax strategies expert, but according to accounts at the time, that was not actually the case in a lot of ways, that he did not have some super sophisticated expertise. And even if he did, it didn't explain just how incredibly wealthy he was, that he had the islands, the multiple homes, the lifestyle, etc. So for that reason, there are also conspiracy theories there that he actually did engage in blackmail of these super wealthy clients, or he was an agent of the Israeli government, etc., etc. The list goes on. In any case, he was known at the time for not only being super wealthy, but super into clearly underage girls. And this has been apparent based on later accounts from people that indicate everyone was aware of this. And you could see this probably most clearly in this book that was put together from all his friends at the time, wishing him a happy birthday, and included, for example, a portion from Trump where under a drawing of a woman, he says something along the lines of, "Here's to life's wonderful secrets. Gee, I wonder what he could mean with that." And on top of that, as we've seen with emails that have been released from the Epstein estate, from the House, Trump in particular knew about what was happening with these underage girls. That this is what Epstein himself wrote in his private correspondence at the time. So this was basically a known thing among all of his peers at the time. And Trump and Epstein basically had like a best friends relationship for a while before a quote unquote falling out, which I'll also get into. So that was Epstein's MO back then, that he and Ghislaine Maxwell would engage in the system of luring young girls between, for example, like 13 to 16 to come to his island or to his houses. And in exchange, they would offer them scholarships, money, any types of opportunities to get them there. And then while they were there, then Epstein and Maxwell engaged in sexual abuse of these underage girls, which is horrible. And even further, that these girls were then trafficked to other wealthy elites as part of this pedophile ring. And those elites that these girls were trafficked to, that's what's being called like the Epstein list, because we understand that basically Epstein was very, very focused, I mean, based on the emails that have since been released from his estate, on leverage over people, and that there was this sort of list of people, even if it wasn't explicitly written down, that was within this circle and participated in these activities. So this went on for decades, but was not in any way addressed, and only in a small way in 2008 in Florida, when there were state charges brought against Epstein for solicitation of a minor and solicitation of prostitution. Now, at the time, Epstein cut a sweetheart deal with someone who would later serve in Trump's first administration to have like a light sentence where he served a bit of time at a state jail and even had privileges to like leave that jail for a certain number of hours each day. So he served that time for those minimal state charges, and then basically just went back to his activities as they were at the time, including with the elites that he had in his circle, with Trump up until they're falling out, they're quote unquote falling out. And he was not actually meaningfully held accountable in any way until actually during the course of Trump's first term in office, when prosecutors in New York brought federal charges against Epstein for the extent of these activities that he was engaged in. And you might already be wondering, oh, well, if Trump has been in the Epstein files, has been implicated in this, why would he let the Department of Justice bring charges against Epstein? Now, you have to remember what things were like in the way back when, in Trump's first term, where he was still trying to play things by the book. He was still trying to look independent from a lot of these things, unlike now Trump's second term, where basically all of that has just disappeared now. So back then, he was trying to keep up this veneer that the Department of Justice was still an independent agency. And even if he had tried to intervene at the time, that would, of course, brought a firestorm on him. Because Trump, as we've seen since then, he can always also go back to this defense of, well, I've done nothing wrong. We've seen that in his later impeachments, in his later criminal cases. It's always like, he's done nothing wrong. And even at the time, there was this narrative developing that, oh, it's actually Democrats who are on the Epstein list and who are involved in this. And so, oh, this was politically useful to him, actually, that the Epstein case was happening, that certain Democrats or people sort of, in the public consciousness as related to Democrats were being implicated in the news cycle, and that basically this Epstein issue was sort of resolving itself without him having to actively intervene. So then, while Epstein is awaiting his further trial, he dies in prison. And the circumstances surrounding that are very mysterious. That it's said that this is a suicide. However, there's a lot of suspicion around a lot of this because he's someone who was on enhanced monitoring after suicide watch, but was being left alone without any cellmate, and the two guards who are on duty were not checking on him at the time. And furthermore, when a video footage has been released after the fact of his cell, there was some portion missing from that footage, and when that portion was later added back in, it shows this orange blob that had some access to the cell, whether this was a prisoner or someone else, if this was someone who came in at the time. And there's this question of whether there was some facilitation to his death. And there was, of course, a long list of people who wanted Epstein to be taken out at that time. And I would not honestly exclude Trump from that list either. So that's the Epstein case itself. And now it comes the part where how this was basically utilized as a political tool by the right. So there's this international pedophile trafficking ring among the global elites led by a guy who dies under mysterious circumstances. And at the time, as mentioned, there's already this narrative that Democrats or people sort of aligned with Democrats are part of the people implicated here and in these activities. And just like with QAnon, the right is so intent on using this story, no matter how much it involves like actual suffering of people, of women here who have suffered as underage girls in this trafficking ring, using that as a political tool against Democrats to say like, oh, just Democrats are the center of all evil and of all weird and occult and criminal activities, and to pretend, of course, that Republicans are not involved in any of this ever, right? Then, when Trump loses the 2020 election and Biden comes in, this basically gets supercharged. That Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Pam Bondi, Dan Bongino, Kash Patel, all of these figures on the right want to then use this to say that they want a release of the Epstein list and the Epstein files. This will then prove their assertion that it's these Democrats, people who are part of this international pedophile ring. And honestly, I don't think liberals really knew how to react to this at the time, because it sounded all very QAnon adjacent, like a lot of this sort of like wild conspiracy theory stuff. But even then, and I think you're seeing this a lot more clearly now, Democrats have been saying, if anybody in our party or aligned with our party is implicated in this, then they should be held to account. Like, it's so funny that the right thinks that we have the same sort of weird and cult following of our political figures, but that's not the case. Democrats, we scrutinize our own as much as we do Republicans a lot of times. And so basically our view here has been, whether it's Bill Clinton or Bill Gates or whoever that gets implicated in these files, they should be held accountable for this. We don't care who is ultimately in it, as long as they are brought to justice. So Trump and the right continue to just pound the table on wanting the release of the files. So, for example, before Trump won the 2024 election, he went on this famous interview with Joe Rogan, where he went on the podcast and he said, among a lot of shit that he was saying at the time, that, oh, well, releasing the Epstein files is going to be his priority, and it's an important thing and should be done on day one. And of course, then Trump comes into office, and that's not what happens, right? That ever since then, there has been delay and obfuscation. So Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has said that, oh, the Epstein list and the Epstein files are on her desk. And then when she was supposedly going to release phase one of these to a group of MAGA influencers, these binders that she handed over to them were basically filled with nothing. That it was a lot of redacted stuff and not any new information beyond what was already known in the public domain. And furthermore, other people are coming out and trying to say there's nothing to see here. So Kash Patel and Dan Bongino give these interviews. They're leading the FBI. They're giving these interviews saying, hey, this was just a suicide. There was really nothing to see here, and we should all just move on from this. So why all of the smoke and mirrors here after so many demands to release the Epstein files? It turns out, based on good reporting that we've had, that Pam Bondi informed Trump that he's in the Epstein files. And so now, of course, ever since Trump has come into office, the story has changed to there's not going to be a release and we should move on, and all of which I find to be complete bullshit. At this point, you're probably wondering, if Trump knew that he could be in the Epstein files or he could be implicated in all of this, why did he push for so many years for the release of the files? And I think we have to go back to just what we know about Trump. That he's a guy who believes that offense is the best defense. So from his perspective, it's always like trying to use these stories as weapons against his opponents. And he always goes back to the same defense of he's done nothing wrong. So it was always a perfect phone call with Zelensky, or it was January 6th was a day of love, or it was a political witch hunt, whether it was the Russia investigation, whether it was the campaign finance charges, whether it was other criminal, whether it was the Mar-a-Lago documents case or other criminal allegations that have been against him. And oh, by the way, he also never knew E. Jean Carroll, or would have never actually sexually assaulted her, right? This is basically what this guy does. He always goes back to the same line that he's done nothing wrong here. And that's what he's been doing with the Epstein files and trying to draw attention to Democrats rather than to him. And of course, his MAGA followers are so ready to cover for him by saying that, oh, well, Trump threw Epstein out of his club years ago, or one of the victims has said that Trump was a complete gentleman. And we know that Trump is a complete scam artist at this point and a manipulator when it comes to so many of these things. So just based on the emails that have been released, even before we see any of these files, whatever we're going to see there, Trump, for example, had spent hours alone with this victim who supposedly called him a gentleman. Do you know any self-proclaimed billionaire who wants to spend hours alone with a 14-year-old, like, just to chat? What is he looking for here? For her views on New York real estate? Beyond that, it was clear from Epstein's private correspondence that Trump knew about what was going on with the girls. That's what he said explicitly. And the reason that there was a falling out between Epstein and Trump was the fact that Epstein was taking underage girls from Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort at the time and using them as his personal masseuse. He was poaching these very young girls. From our understanding then, the reason for this falling out was basically a business complaint. That Trump did not like that his staff was being recruited by someone else. And finally, another big one from this emails release has been that Trump gave a blowjob to someone named Bubba, which has turned out, or people speculate, is that it may be Bill Clinton, potentially someone else, and that there was a photo of this, and that photo has somehow landed in the hands of Vladimir Putin. That would certainly explain why during both of Trump's presidencies, he has never explicitly condemned Russia for anything. And there's a lot of examples that we can point to of where he has stopped short of doing that. So that's basically how the right has used this as a political tool first. And then as soon as it was not useful anymore for them, or as soon as their guy who turned out to be implicated in this, they immediately folded completely on this being an issue at all. Now going to what we're likely to see in these files and what this represents about the Epstein class. So right now, there is this bill requiring the DOJ to release the files, even though they could already do that today, even though Trump could just release the files today. So right now, this bill has passed requiring the DOJ to release the files. There's two important things to keep in mind about this. First is, Trump could always just release the files already, even without this bill. This was something that was forcing the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to do that. But he could just tell the DOJ to go ahead and release them. However, that has not been the case ever since Trump has come into office. And even now, after this bill has passed, there's been plenty of time where they could do that release, but they're taking their sweet time to do so. So already this is sort of raising questions. Second, the bill that passed has included a number of exceptions about what can be released. And one of those exceptions is also if anything is subject to an ongoing investigation. And very conveniently, Pam Bondi, right around the time that there's supposed to be this release, has announced new investigations based on new information that has come out related to this case. So this is to say that that's one of the exceptions that could apply here, where the Department of Justice said, oh, we need to hold back so much of these files, we need to redact so much of this because this is subject to an ongoing investigation. This is all to say that what we're very likely to see here is, in fact, a cover-up. That we may very well see that there is a release that implicates Democrats or people aligns with the Democrats in the public perception, and then maybe one or two Republicans as a decoy. But what we're likely to see is no implication of Trump, or a very limited one, or one that even frames him in some sort of good light. And I don't know if this is actually going to hold, being how many people have seen these files at this point. But based on the delays and the smoke and mirrors that we've seen already, that it just seems to be most likely the case of what's going on. And as we know, the DOJ at this point, they're not an independent agency. This is led by people who are Trump's personal lapdog lawyers who are more interested in defending him rather than carrying out justice. And behind all of this is this bigger idea of the Epstein class that is as horrible as what has happened here. It's representative also of this sort of bigger problem as well, of this group of elites who feel like the normal rules and laws of society don't apply to them, that they are not satisfied with the everything that money and status would normally bring, that they want to go even beyond all of that, and that they can do these illegal and criminal activities and not be held accountable for it. Because that's the story of Trump's life, right? That he can engage in this conduct for decades and not be held accountable for it because he is above all of this, and it's okay when he does it, but not when anyone else. And even on this blowjob to Bubba, for example, that it's okay when a member of the Epstein class does gay stuff behind closed doors, but it's not okay when people identified as they, them, and pronouns, or trans kids just exist. It's this hypocrisy that is so apparent now in the current MAGA movement that basically covers for the elite while going after people who are in fact so vulnerable in our society. Because that's what the Epstein class is about at the end of the day. It's about one set of rules for them and another set of rules for the rest of society. So they can break whatever laws that they want. They can engage in criminal activities. But if there's even the slightest infraction for a Democrat or someone aligned with the Democrats, or God forbid, someone who is an immigrant or an LGBTQ person, then it's the harshest possible punishment for them. Meanwhile, Trump and his clown squad are celebrating at Mar-a-Lago the corruption, the crime, the weird stuff that they are doing behind closed doors because they can get away with it as being part of this Epstein class that is not going to be held accountable. And unfortunately, that's now our project. That's our project as Democrats, to hold these type of people accountable, whether they're red or blue. And it's up to us to continue to push for that as a Democratic base and to demand that of our Democratic politicians, because that's not what Trump or Republicans are interested in doing at this point. So cheers to that effort, and I'll see you probably next week.